All right, so let's dive into something I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. And heck, maybe even sitting right there on your phone. It's TikTok.
Yeah.
TikTok, you've probably seen, I don't know, a few of the viral dances, maybe even tried a few yourself. But behind those catchy tunes, there's this whole serious legal battle brewing.
Yeah.
And it could like reshape social media,
Yeah.
like as we know it.
That's pretty crazy.
We're talking about a potential U.S. TikTok ban. And we've got a stack of sources here, news articles, legal analyses, even some firsthand accounts from small businesses.
Mm.
And it's a pretty complicated picture.
Yeah. You know what's interesting here is that it's not just about like an app. It's about it's this clash of national security concerns, freedom of speech, and even like the livelihoods of everyday people.
Exactly. So to help you cut through all the noise, we're going to break down the key arguments, the potential consequences, and we're going to give you the information you need so you can form your own opinion. On this whole TikTok saga, first off, can you give us like a timeline of how we got to this point, where the Supreme Court is now involved?
Absolutely. So this story actually goes back to 2020, when then-President Trump issued those executive orders targeting TikTok over concerns about data security and its Chinese ownership. And that kind of ignited this legal whirlwind of challenges, congressional hearings, and even some proposed solutions from TikTok's parent company, ByteDance.
Wow, so this has been a long time coming.
Yeah.
And just last month, a federal appeals court upheld a law that would force ByteDance to like divest from TikTok.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal, right? It basically sent the whole case straight to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it was a pivotal moment for sure. December 6, 2024, mark that date. ByteDance is now trying to delay the ban while they appeal to the Supreme Court. But it really puts a spotlight on like how high the stakes are.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of the matter. What are these national security concerns that are fueling this push for a ban?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the worst case scenario that the government is like worried about?
Yeah, so the core concern revolves around data privacy and the potential for the Chinese government to access user data through TikTok. There are fears that this data could be used for all sorts of things, from surveillance and influence operations to spreading misinformation and even propaganda. And in the current geopolitical climate, that's a really sensitive issue.
But hold on, though. Doesn't like every social media app collect tons of data on us? I mean, what makes TikTok uniquely vulnerable to this kind of scrutiny?
It comes down to trust, or rather a lack thereof. The U.S. government has expressed deep concerns that Chinese law could compel ByteDance to hand over user data, regardless of what the company says publicly. And this lack of trust, mixed with the already tense relationship between the U.S. and China, puts TikTok in a very difficult position. It's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place.
And to be fair to TikTok, haven't they consistently denied these allegations and even tried to put safeguards in place?
They have. TikTok has repeatedly emphasized that they've never shared user data with the Chinese government and have even taken steps to safeguard U.S. user data. They even came up with this plan called Project Texas, where they partnered with a U.S.-based company, Oracle, to manage and secure U.S. user data. The idea was to create this sort of firewall between TikTok and its Chinese parent company. But it hasn't been enough to convince everyone.
Okay, so we've got this clash between national security concerns and TikTok's claims of data security. But this case also brings up some serious First Amendment questions, right? I mean, isn't banning an entire app a bit of a slippery slope when it comes to freedom of speech?
You're hitting on a crucial point. Several lawsuits have argued that a TikTok ban would violate Americans' First Amendment rights. They say the ban is overly broad and would silence a platform where millions of Americans express themselves, share information, build businesses, and, just have fun.
Yeah, it's not just about silly dances. People's livelihoods are at stake here. What about the people who support the ban? How do they justify restricting free speech?
Those in favor of the ban argue that the government has a compelling interest in protecting national security, even if it means putting some limits on certain forms of speech. They say the ban targets TikTok specifically because of its ties to China, not because of the content itself. So it's not about censoring specific ideas, but about addressing a potential threat to national security.
It's interesting how this whole thing forces us to think about where the line is between national security and individual freedoms, especially in the digital age. It's not a simple issue, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
Exactly. And to make things even more complex, there's a real human impact here that we need to consider. One of our sources, an article from New Orleans City Business, talks about how small businesses are really feeling the pressure of this potential ban. Many of them rely on TikTok for marketing and reaching their customers, and losing that platform could be devastating for them.
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the legal arguments, But this is about real people's lives and livelihoods. If TikTok disappears, there will be a ripple effect felt across the digital landscape, especially in the world of advertising.
Absolutely. TikTok has become a major player in digital advertising, especially for reaching a younger audience. If it's gone, those advertising dollars will have to go somewhere else, which could create a much more competitive and expensive landscape for businesses trying to stand out online.
So we've got national security concerns, legal battles, free speech arguments, economic fallout. It's a lot to unpack. But this isn't just a U.S. issue, right? Other countries have grappled with this whole TikTok ban thing, too. Can you give us some global context?
The U.S. isn't alone in this. India banned TikTok back in 2020, and several U.S. states have implemented bans. On government devices, this reflects a growing global trend of governments trying to figure out how to handle the security implications of social media platforms, particularly those with ties to China.
This is like a whole new digital battleground with data as the weapon.
In a way, yeah. And it's making people wonder what the future holds. Will the internet become more fragmented, with different countries having their own rules and regulations? Or will we find a way to balance global connectivity with these national security concerns? It's a question that experts are grappling with right now.
Well, those are some pretty weighty questions. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, laying out the different sides of this complex issue. But before we jump into the legal specifics and potential outcomes, let's take a moment to really understand the core of Project Texas. TikTok's attempt to address these concerns. Why hasn't it been enough? And could it offer any clues about what the future might hold for the app?
Yeah, let's take a look. So Project Texas was a pretty ambitious plan, you have to give them, that essentially aimed to put Oracle, a US-based tech giant, in charge of managing and securing all US user data for TikTok.
So basically like building a wall between TikTok and its Chinese parent company, right?
That's the idea. They wanted to create this impenetrable barrier, this firewall, that would theoretically stop the Chinese government from accessing any US user data. But, in the world of tech and data, firewalls aren't always as foolproof as we'd like to think.
Okay, so walk us through this. Why hasn't Project Texas been enough to calm the storm? I mean, on the surface, it seems like a reasonable compromise.
There are a few reasons. First, some cybersecurity experts are skeptical about whether you can truly separate TikTok from its Chinese roots, even with Oracle in the picture. The technology behind TikTok, the algorithms that make it tick, they're all deeply intertwined with ByteDance's infrastructure. It's not like flipping a switch and suddenly all the data is flowing through a different pipe.
So it's like trying to untangle a really complicated knot, maybe even impossible.
Exactly. And then there's the question of oversight and control. Even with Oracle managing the data, there are concerns about how much visibility the U.S. government would have, whether they could truly ensure that no backdoors or vulnerabilities exist that could allow data to slip through.
So even with this elaborate plan, there's still this underlying lack of trust. It feels like it boils down to whether anyone believes that TikTok can truly be independent from its Chinese ownership. You've hit the nail on the head, and that's the fundamental question the Supreme Court will have to wrestle with. Do they prioritize national security above everything else, potentially setting a precedent that could impact any foreign-owned tech company operating in the U.S., or do they side with TikTok, saying this ban is a step too far, a violation of free speech, and a dangerous move towards online censorship? It's a tough call, and speaking of tough calls, let's get back to the legal nitty-gritty. We talked earlier about the First Amendment arguments, but I want to unpack that a bit more. What are the specific legal precedents at play here, this whole strict scrutiny thing? Can you break that down for us?
Okay, imagine strict scrutiny as the highest hurdle the government has to clear when it wants to restrict your fundamental rights, like freedom of speech. They can't just say national security and call it a day. They have to prove that this ban is absolutely essential, that there's no other, less restrictive way to achieve their goal.
So is the government's argument that national security is at risk enough to justify restricting free speech? I mean, where do we draw the line? Couldn't they use that argument to shut down any website or app they don't like?
That's the debate raging in the courts right now. The government is arguing that the potential for the Chinese government to access user data through TikTok poses such a grave threat to national security that a ban is warranted. They point to the vast amount of data. TikTok collects everything from your location and browsing history to, even in some cases, things like biometric data from facial recognition features.
But I mean, Facebook, Google, they all collect tons of data on us too. What makes TikTok so different?
It all comes back to that issue of trust and the perceived influence of the Chinese government. There's this fear that Chinese law could force ByteDance to hand over data, even if they claim otherwise. And in the current political climate, with tensions rising between the U.S. and China, that fear is amplified.
It's like TikTok is caught in the crosshairs of a much bigger conflict. It must be incredibly frustrating for the company and its users, especially those who depend on the app for their livelihood.
It's a difficult position to be in, no doubt. And, TikTok has tried to address these concerns. We've talked about Project Texas, but they've also argued that they have robust data security measures in place, that U.S. user data is stored securely, and that they would never comply with any requests from the Chinese government to compromise that data.
So they're basically saying, trust us, but it seems like that's not enough in the current climate.
Trust is a hard thing to earn, especially when national security is involved, and that brings us back to the potential scenarios for how this might all play out. And let's explore those possibilities, because each one could have significant implications for TikTok, for social media, and for the digital landscape as a whole.
All right, so let's put on our prognostication hats or something and try to predict the future. What are the most likely scenarios here? And what might they mean for TikTok, for us, the users, and for the whole social media landscape?
Okay, so let's game this out. Scenario 1. The Supreme Court sides with the lower court's ruling, forcing ByteDance to sell off TikTok. This could mean a full sale to a U.S. company, maybe a partial sale, or even spinning it off into a completely separate entity. Each option has its own hurdles and potential consequences.
So let's say TikTok ends up in the hands of a U.S. company. Does that magically solve all the national security concerns? Would the app even stay the same, TikTok we know, and maybe even love it?
Well, it's not a silver bullet, that's for sure. A U.S. owner might ease some worries about the Chinese government's influence. But those data privacy issues wouldn't just vanish. Remember, U.S. tech companies have their own history of data collection and sharing practices that have raised eyebrows, to put it mildly. Plus, the very heart of TikTok's algorithm, the way it personalizes content based on your data, that in itself raises inherent privacy questions.
Now let's be real. Would a change in ownership mess with that special TikTok sauce? You know, that mix of creativity, humor, and that sometimes wonderfully weird side of TikTok.
That's the million-dollar question. A new owner might try to tweak the algorithm, moderate content differently, or introduce new features, maybe trying to stand out, maybe trying to appease regulators, who knows. But those changes could alienate the users. Who made TikTok what it is? It could change the vibe. And that could impact its popularity and whether it's even profitable.
Okay, so that's one path. What other possibilities are on the table?
Scenario 2. The Supreme Court slams the brakes on the ban, siding with TikTok's arguments about free speech and due process. This would be a huge win for TikTok and a major blow to the government's efforts to restrict the app, but it wouldn't necessarily be the end of the story.
So even if TikTok emerges victorious, the fight might drag on.
Exactly. Those national security concerns wouldn't just evaporate. We could see more legal challenges,
Right.
stricter regulations, maybe even renewed calls for boycotts. It would be a victory, but a messy one, with a lot of uncertainty about the future.
Okay, suspense is building. Is there another door number 3?
There's always door number 3. It's less likely, but still possible. A negotiated settlement. This could involve some give and take from both sides. Maybe beefed up data security measures, greater transparency about how data is handled, or even limits on what types of data TikTok can collect in the first place.
A compromise sounds sensible, but it would require a level of trust and good faith that seems to be in short supply these days, especially in this whole U.S.-China tech showdown.
You're not wrong. Building that trust would be a monumental task in the current climate. But a negotiated solution could be a way to address the legitimate security concerns without resorting to a complete ban, which, as we've discussed, is a Pandora's box of complexities and potential downsides.
So let's bring it back to our listener. What can they do to stay informed and make sense of this whole saga as it unfolds?
First and foremost, stay curious. Don't just skim the headlines or swallow whatever social media throws at you. Dig deeper into the arguments, seek out different perspectives, and challenge your own assumptions. Pay attention to how this case unfolds, because it's not just about TikTok. It's about the future of the internet, the balance between security and freedom, and the power dynamics of the digital age.
And on a more practical level, if you're a TikTok creator or a business owner using the platform, it might be a good idea to start thinking about backup plans, just in case the worst-case scenario happens. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, as the saying goes.
That's excellent advice. Diversification is key in any field, and the digital world is no different. But beyond the practicalities, I think the most important takeaway here is to be aware of the data you share online. Regardless of the platform, read those terms of service. Think critically about the information you're giving away, and support policies that protect your privacy and your right to express yourself freely.
Well said. We've explored a lot of twists and turns today, But one thing is crystal clear. This story is far from over. As the legal battle continues and the geopolitical landscape shifts, TikTok's fate hangs in the balance. But whatever happens, this case has sparked a crucial conversation about the influence of social media, the challenges of data security, and the delicate dance between national interests and individual freedoms in our digital world.
And that's a conversation we need to keep having. So we leave you with this. If you were a Supreme Court justice, how would you weigh those national security concerns against the potential infringement on free speech? What factors would you prioritize? There's no easy answer. But by wrestling with these tough questions, we can all play a part in shaping a more informed and equitable digital future.
That's a wrap for our deep dive into the TikTok saga. We hope you found this exploration insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit entertaining. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.